Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about the nature of prophetic fulfillment in our continuing study of end times prophecy. My older brother lives in Munich, actually on the north side of the city, and my first time visiting there, he took me to one of these churches. I don't remember which one it was, and we went way up into the steeple and looked to the south. What he wanted me to do is to catch a glimpse of the Alps to the south. As it turned out, that day was overcast, but it snowed that night and got all the smog out of the air. And the next day, when we got up and looked to the south, you could just see the mountains in the distance. And you couldn't tell when you were at ground level. It's a little bit different when you see here in this picture. But at ground level, it just looked like a chain of mountains just stretching from horizon to horizon. And you couldn't tell until you got into them that beyond the first mountain would be a valley, and then another mountain, and then another valley. The scriptures are a bit like that when especially when we're looking at fulfillments, multiple fulfillments, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, they didn't have the New Testament yet. So sometimes the prophet would be looking at things that are going to happen, and you can't tell as he's looking, is he speaking of things that are close by or things far in the future, or maybe sometimes both at the same time. So, an example of this is in our very well known passage, Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. Therefore, the Lord Himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. And you ask almost any Christian, to what does this refer? And they would say, well, of course, it refers to the birth of Jesus, that he would be born of a virgin. And I'm not going to dispute that, but I'm saying you see something else when you look at the passage in its context. Let's go back and look at this passage. It's written in the time around the early 700s BC. It's taking place in Judah, and of course, Judah and Israel were two separate countries by this time. And then you also had Aram and Assyria, and Assyria was the big world threat. But what happens is our story opens in Isaiah chapter 7, is that Aram and Israel have joined forces to to form a military alliance against Assyria, but they're wanting Judah to join, and Judah doesn't want to do that. And so our story opens, chapter 7, verse 1. Now it came about in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah. So he's the king of the southern kingdom of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem. Notice they've been trying to get them to sign on to their alliance, but Judah didn't want to do that. And so they go up to Jerusalem to wage war against it. And they try to conquer it, but they could not conquer it. We continue, verse 3. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out now to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, take care and be calm, have no fear, and do not be faint-hearted because of these two stubs of smoldering firebrands, on account of the fierce anger of Rezin. Remember, that's the king of Aram, and the son of Remaliah. That's the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. These two kings that are coming against the king of Judah. Verse 5, because Aram with Ephraim, Ephraim, the son of Remaliah, has planned evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrorize it and make for ourselves a breach in its walls and set up the son of Tabeel. Notice they've already got a replacement king for Ahaz. Tabeel is king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. So they have their plans, but God says it's not going to happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus. Remember, Aram, the capital of Aram is the city of Damascus. And the head of Damascus is Rezin. Now, within another 65 years, Ephraim is one of the chief tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel. Ephraim will be shattered so that it is no longer a people. Now, that particular prophecy, this is around 735 BC. By 670 BC, we're going to see something happens where the Assyrian king Esarhaddon transplants foreigners to the land of Ephraim. Um, So you're going to have the northern kingdom of Israel will not only be destroyed and their inhabitants will be dispersed, but then a number of years later, within those 65 years, you're going to have outsiders that are going to move into the northern kingdom of Israel, especially the area of Ephraim, and they will set up shop there. So this is going to be literally fulfilled, not immediately in Isaiah's day, but shortly thereafter, very shortly. Verse 10. Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz. Ahaz is the king of Judah. Ask for a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Now, that sounds on the surface of it, it'd be good. But when God said to ask, then you should ask. Verse 13, then he said, listen now, O house of David, because Ahaz is a descendant of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore, and here's our target prophecy, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Now, this is Ahaz has been told to ask for a sign. He didn't want to ask for one. So God says, I'm going to give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Now, I want you to see this, that's a sentence, but it's not a standalone sentence. It had a former story leading up to it, and it has verses afterward as well. So notice that term virgin. The Revised Standard Version renders this a young woman. And let me just say for the record, that's actually an okay translation. Now, if I'm not denying the virgin birth of Jesus, I'm just saying that the Hebrew word, the Hebrew term here, the Hebrew and the New English translation says this young woman. The Hebrew text has the word ha'alma, not just a virgin, but the, and alma is normally rendered. I would normally render it a maiden, which usually is a virgin, but it's not virginity that's the central thing. It's that it's a young woman who isn't married yet, so of course you would expect her to be a virgin. The maiden, as I said. The Septuagint, though, now that's the Greek translation made hundreds of years later, but still long before the birth of Jesus, rendered it He Parthenos, which does mean the virgin. And there's a whole story behind that term. And so, which is why we get our English translation, most of our translations, King James and New American Standard have rendered it either a virgin or the virgin. The word the is there in the Septuagint, and it's there in the Hebrew text as well. So I don't see any reason to leave that out. The virgin will be with child. I'd go along with, or the maiden, that works as well. And so, like I said, the Septuagint rendering just means the virgin. That's actually what it means. Now, notice she will call his name Emmanuel. Now, that term, Emmanuel, is Hebrew, means the L part stands for Elohim, God. God with us is what it means. However, if I continue to read the next verse, notice, he, who's the he? Well, that sounds like Emmanuel. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy, who's the boy, I'm assuming the same one, before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. Now, do you see what's happening in the context of this chapter? The immediate fulfillment of this prophecy of the words of Isaiah, we're looking to a child that would be born to a young woman. She wasn't married yet, apparently, but she's going to I'm assuming she would get married and then have a child. And before that child was on solid food, the two kings that Ahaz was worried about would be taken out of the picture. And that was literally fulfilled. However, the Gospel of Matthew quotes this passage. Now, it doesn't quote the whole passage, just quotes verse 14. And says, that sounds a lot like that sees the fulfillment in the person of Jesus. It's not denying the other fulfillment, the former fulfillment, but it says there's words there that echo with the story of Jesus as well. So notice that he will know enough. The boy, I think that's speaking about Emmanuel. The two kings, we've already looked at who those are. But what I have here is both a near and a far fulfillment. Now, the meaning of that term fulfillment. First of all, let me just say it's different from our use of the term. Sometimes It's not just where a promise is given and then the promise takes place, but sometimes it's the application of a passage. That's known in Hebrew as a midrash, and we actually have a number of commentaries or midrash. They're applications that where a passage is taken from the Old Testament, and it's not necessarily talking about what it means, but how it is applied to a particular situation. And of course, we just suggested that there are times when there are multiple fulfillments of any given passage. Now, I want to talk next about categories of fulfillment. First of all, there are non-predictions. There's sometimes where there's a fulfillment, but there hasn't been any prediction. We're going to see some of those. One of those is Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, where Hosea is saying, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. If you read the context of that passage, God's talking about how he brought the nation of Israel out of Egypt and has blessed that nation. But these words are used again in Matthew chapter 2 to speak of Jesus, how that in the same way Israel was brought out of Egypt, so also Jesus is brought out of Egypt. So this wasn't ever given as a prediction in the book of Hosea, but nevertheless it has a fulfillment. So non-predictions can have a fulfillment. Secondly, we have predictions that are completed, where something is predicted and then it takes place. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, we actually had a prediction that was completed, and yet it had a further application in the person of Jesus. I think that's an appropriate way to see that. We also have predictions that are uninitiated, where, see, in Isaiah 7:14, you'd actually had something that was initiated back in Isaiah's day. There are prophecies that never saw that sort of thing. Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. It continues, the next part of the verse. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Never in the Old Testament or really up until the coming of Jesus, never did that prophecy begin to be fulfilled. There was no initiation of it at an earlier date.